Okay, we'll give people a few more minutes before we start. Christian, will you be presenting today, or will Paul be joining you or something?
Paul is joining, and it's not entirely clear if Tobias will be able to join because he's traveling. Probably not.
Okay. Okay, let's get going. 3 minutes past here, so welcome everyone to OAUTH Group Virtual Interims. So let's get going. So this is a reminder that NOTWELL applies here. This, as you know, and if you don't know, make sure you get familiar with this. This governs everything that we do at the IETF. So make sure you're familiar with this. This is important. This is a reminder. There is the OAuth security workshop. It's going to happen in February, coming soon. And if you're interested, please register and see if you can join them in Reykjavik, Iceland, in February. Today we'll be talking about token status list. I think Christian and I think Paul joined us too, so they will be presenting this topic. We still have 2 more to go, one-time token and private key jot at the end. We're not clear about the one for next week, the one-time token. We'll give you an update on this one if it's going to happen or not. But that's our schedule for now. Any questions? Any comments? Okay. If not, I will hand it to Christian. Will you be driving?
Paul is starting. Are you going to share slides, or should we try to share?
I can give you control, and you can share the slides and drive it.
Okay, then
there you go.
Welcome everyone. I'm Paul. Christian is with me. He will take the second part of this presentation, and we also have Tobias Looker as the third co-author, who, as quite often, as he's living on the other side of the earth, these time slots are not so well suited for him, so excuse him that he can't join us today. And we'll talk about token status list, give a refresher of what the draft is about, and then we will go into the feedback that we have. As a reminder, we started the working group last week on the mailing list. Okay, then let's go into it. As a refresher, what's the problem, the motivation behind this? We have tokens like CBOR Web Tokens or JSON Web Tokens that have been issued and contain certain information. And in certain scenarios, the issuer of this token may want to convey or communicate status information about this token before it expires. So this, is most likely about revocation. We frame it a little bit more general as a status mechanism, but the main use case here is, of course, revocation. Next slide, please. The key facts about token status list. It is a very scalable revocation mechanism. It has similar properties like X509 certificate revocation lists. It definitely has very similar privacy properties, but it has quite enhanced scaling properties. The design was, from our point of view, intended to be simple to understand and easy to implement. The token status list is referenced by, or the draft is referenced by other standards. We have SD.VC, which is referencing the token status list and the status mechanism framework that we create, and also the ISO 18013-5 MDoc amendment that is being created. So ISO 18013-5 is a published standard, and there's currently an amendment that's being drafted that also reference the token status list. It's also named by the ARF, that's the Architecture Reference Framework. It's a technical guiding document for the upcoming EIDAS framework. It is the European Identity Framework, and it discusses several options for revocation, and the token status list is one of them that's being named. The token status list has been tested at various interop events and hackathons. So we have kind of proof that it works, and we've got some real world feedback. And it also does not just create a single status mechanism, but it establishes an extension point and creates an IANA registry for other status mechanisms as well. So it creates a framework for status mechanism and the token status list itself as the first one to fulfill this. Okay, on the next slide, I'll draw the big picture of which entities are involved here. At the bottom picture, we have the roles that are part of this. We have the issuer on the left side. We've differentiated the issuer into certain sub-roles. But in general, we have the issuer that is issuing a so-called referenced token to the holder. The reference token could be in different formats. It could be, for example, in SD.VC and ISO MDoc, but could also be any other thing. The draft does not make any specific statements about what the reference token should be. The holder then may present this reference token to the relying party. So we have a usual pattern that we see from other drafts and standards as well, sometimes also called issuer holder verifier model or three-party model. Now, on top of this, we differentiated the issuer in our draft into three subcomponents, which make sense for the status mechanism. So we have the issuer that is issuing the reference token. Then we have a status issuer. This is the entity then that is issuing or creating the status list token. And then we have a status provider, which is a party that's actually hosting or providing the status list token on a public endpoint. And the relying party may fetch this status list token from the status provider. We have the reference token in the top picture, which is most likely a Jose or Kose based signed artifact that references a status list via a URI. The status list has two possible formats. It could be in JSON or in CBOR, and it describes the status of multiple reference tokens. And the status list is embedded in a status list token for integrity and authenticity. And the status list token is a JSON web token or a CBOR web token. So that's about the architecture of the status list. And then on the next slide, we'll go a little bit more in detail. So here we have the reference token as an example. And this is a Jose-based format, so that could be possibly a JSON web token or an ASCII-JOT. We have certain claims in here which are not relevant for us. The relevant claim here that we introduce is the status claim, and this is the aforementioned extension point for other status mechanisms. So including the status claim in your payload, in your claims of your reference token might signal that this is the status mechanism. Underneath, we have the status list claim, which then signalizes that this reference token uses the status list as the status mechanism. And then in the status list, we have here two claims. The first one is the URI, which is pointing to the public endpoint where the status list token is hosted by the status provider. And then we have the index 5 in this example, which is a number that represents the index within the status list that describes exactly this reference token. And on the next slide, we will see how this then works out. So the URI will point to a status list token. In this example here, we have the status list in the JSON web token format. So we could use the header to figure out the integrity and authenticity of the token. We have a new type that we define, status list plus JOT, and then we have some other data in the payload, like expiration date, issue at date, that describes when this was created, the status list token. Most importantly, we have the status list claim, and that includes two members. The first one is bits in this example 1, and bits describes how many bits are used within a byte array to convey the status of exactly one reference token. So in this example, this means there is 1 bit used within a byte array to convey the status of a reference token. So in this example, then it's a valid or not valid. If you have more than 2 states that you want to convey or that you want to describe your reference token with, then you could use bigger values here. So if you use bits 2, then you have 4 possible states that describe the status of the reference token. And then most importantly, we have the LST, the list, which is a base 64 encoded value in this example. And on the next slide, we will then see how the status list token and the reference token fits together. So on top, we have the reference token. The URI points to the status list token. which is also the sub-value and the status list token, so they can be cross-referenced. And then from the status list, we have the list, which is in this example base 64, encoded and compressed byte array. So we deflate here with the zlib standard to get the raw byte array. And then in the raw byte array, we look at the index 5 position, and this value then gives information about the status of the reference token. Okay, on the next slide, I will hand over to Christian.
Yeah, hello. So we have echo. Okay, it's fine now. Where are we at right now? So we have some more changes that are currently in the editor's copy. These are mainly feedback, like review and feedback we've gotten so far.
Christian,
yeah.
Sorry, there is a question from Arndt. Arndt, do you wanna state your question here instead of the chat?
That's the reason I put it in the question. I didn't want to ask right here because I believe probably it has been asked before. But I always wondered, if we go back to the previous slide, if bits is 2, for example, how would a verifier know which bits to consider invalid and not valid? Like with 1 bit, it's clear, but with 2, it can be a bit more difficult, right?
So one thing we've started is also basically enum registration. So yes, we have predefined values. That's also part of a discussion that's currently ongoing on the mailing list, I guess, like one of the feedbacks. But we have some predefined values, yes.
Okay. Yep. Thank you.
Okay. Hannes, you have a question?
Yeah, Paul, in one of the first slides with the architecture, I think he was, this slide. You separated the functionality out into issuer, status provider. I'm wondering whether that's a little bit too excessive or realistic, that people will sort of like create. I understand if you want to separate the issuer from the status list issuer, but then separating the issuer from the provider doesn't sound like a sort of obvious choice. Could you explain?
Yeah, so in general, I agree that it's more of exotic use cases, but for both use cases of splitting this, we got requests. The first one was that, for example, in the mobile driving license use cases, the issuer may not be the same party as the one that is doing the revocation. So that would be a different issuer from a different status issuer. And then we got the request that the status issuer may not be the same as the status provider. That could be for either scalability and or privacy reasons, because the status provider gets the information which relying party is actually fetching this if he's looking up the IP addresses. And at the same time, it may be interesting to source this out, as the status list tokens are static data. So you may hand this out to a CDN or some highly scalable infrastructure, so that if you have massive amounts of relying parties fetching this data, then you may give this to a status provider that is not yourself.
Maybe that piece of context is missing in the document, because also this diagram sort of gives the impression that the issuer knows about the revocation status, and that's why the arrow goes down and updates the status. But what you have been just explaining is it's actually the use case where the issuer and the status issuer is separate, is in the case where some third party is allowed to make some changes to the status of the status list.
I will recheck that we have examples for this in the spec to illustrate the motivation on this.
Okay, that's good. And another point, I thought it would be useful to also reference some of the prior work on this this topic, because it just I think in general it's a good practice to do reference prior work, and also from a sort of like legal patent etc. point of view, it may also be useful.
Hannes, do you have specific references in mind?
Yeah, sure. I can post them into the chat window.
Yeah, and add them maybe to the notes. Would be great.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Hannes.
Yeah,
Denis?
we got some split opinions, both in the editors group and also from other people. So if more people could chime in whether they think that's a good idea or not, that would help us.
Okay, Denis?
Yes. About this topic, I have a major problem with the wording used in this document. It states, if not further specified, the term issuer may refer to an entity acting for all three roles. And in many cases, it's very important to make a difference between the status list token issuer and the reference token issuer. And this is not done in this document. So at many times there has been a confusion, and this needs to be corrected. This afternoon, this afternoon for me, but not for you. Well, 2 hours before this meeting, I sent 3 issues, and one of these issues is making the correction between the confusion that was made between the status list token issuer and the reference token issuer. And it's very important to be able to differentiate these two roles. That's it.
Right, then I would continue, if that's fine.
Yep, keep going.
All right, so as I was starting, current status is basically we have an editor's copy that we are collecting all of the feedback and the latest changes based on the feedback we've gotten. We've gotten some feedback from Ayana regarding the registrations. We fixed all of the issues and from that feedback. We emphasized that, I think there was also feedback from, sorry, I forgot. We emphasized that the privacy considerations apply to status list and no other status mechanisms. That was also from you, Dennis, right? Or Denise. We differentiated unlinkability between issuer and relying party and RP to RP unlinkability because they're different. A small typo. And we renamed the Ayana registrations because we have kind of a redundancy with status mechanism methods. So right now it's only called status mechanisms. So when we made these slides like a week ago, we saw basically all major issues were closed in the repository, and we had dealt with most parts of the feedback, or like all bigger parts of the feedbacks, and then we got some more mails. The first question we would like to have some opinion on would be test vectors. So we had been discussing this a bit internally. Should we add a bigger appendix and provide bigger and more test vectors for like all bit encodings, for example? So the spec allows 1-bit, 2-bit, 4-bit, and 8-bit status lists. We would then move, basically, we have currently a section, I think section 13, with 2-bit examples. As an addition, we would then move all of that into an appendix and create more and bigger test vectors. Is there any opinion on that? I think there was one answer which was saying on the mailing list this would be appreciated. Are there any more opinions?
Justin.
Yeah, so I'm always a fan of lots of test vectors in a document like this. I think that it makes a lot of sense. That said, you do need to balance like what's available, obviously, in the doc and what's available sort of in the wider world. One of the things we did with HTTP signatures was have a lot of test vectors in there, but we also made the httpsig.org website which isn't referenced directly in the document, but it's pretty easy to find if you're looking for information about the RFC. So if there are a lot of sort of especially complex examples and things like that, I'd recommend the authors to consider additional resources beyond the RFC as a target to hold some of this.
Right, thank you. Any more opinions? Or any feedback of people who read or tried to implement the spec and were feeling that they would like to have more test vectors? Then let's move on. Yeah, there was one larger email with feedback. We split that up into different parts. Partitioning. So the email said, I think we should strongly recommend partitioning status lists by expiry of issued tokens. This makes retirement much easier. And we have text currently in the spec that basically says, hey, once all reference tokens in a status list token are expired, the issuer may stop serving the status list token. We thought about this also, but we were a bit careful to add that because basically putting stuff together is also a form of correlation, right? It adds privacy concerns. So we were considering rewriting the implementation, considering considerations, making that a bit more explicit. So basically say, hey, if you partition stuff in several status lists next to each other, you might want to make sure that they have similar expiration times so you can stop serving them at some point in time. And like you don't have to serve these things forever. Are there any opinions on this?
So obviously there's partitioning or grouping, I wouldn't call it partitioning, but grouping tokens on the status list together based on their expiry assumes that you have vastly different expiries in some sense, right? But if they all sort of like expire, let's say you issue tokens for 2 years, then like this whole partitioning is moot, right? So do you have those use cases where this really makes a difference?
I guess we were kind of expecting this to happen naturally. So if you are using a status list for one specific token, then the tokens will likely have the same expiration time. So you'd be grouping it automatically, basically in 1 or 2 status lists.
Yeah,
and
that's what I would suspect as well.
Yeah, so that is also why we didn't add more explicit text, but yeah, feedback is welcome.
It also depends majorly on the reference token and the privacy properties of the reference token. If you have an issued at date anyway in every reference token that you share, then like partitioning does not create any additional privacy risk. So in general, sometimes it's hard to give a general answer for status list because privacy implications or privacy requirements may also be very different depending whether the underlying reference token is used for natural persons or not.
Okay. Denis?
Yes, I would recommend that you pay attention to the comment I sent about 2 hours ago, which is number 219, because I propose a complete rewriting on the implementation consideration section. And I have focused on the case where you want to use one-time use reference tokens. And then there are different recommendations. And well, simply please take a look at this rewording because it is rather important. Thank you.
And Denis, could you summarize what your main point on the implementation considerations are?
Oh, yes, basically. First, I can read roughly what I've proposed. Well, I propose to issue status list tokens in advance. And I gave the examples where the issuer has not yet issued a single reference token, but he has prepared, for example, 50 status list tokens that are not yet used for any issue token. And when he will start issuing reference token, he will at random choose an index in one of these status lists. So it means that you cannot really correlate the reference token together. Then what is important from an implementation point issue is to realize the number of status list tokens that will be needed between two updates, so that you can basically know how many you will need to use. And the size and the number of the status list token will be highly dependent whether one-time use reference token will be used or not be used. Now, if you use one-time use reference token, in order to reduce the number of status list tokens that will need to be maintained by the status list issuer, it is recommended to use short-lived reference tokens. When I mean short-lived, I mean, for example, valid during a week or a month at most. And another recommendation is to say that the holder should automatically renew these reference tokens as soon as they are consumed. And then to the other recommendation, which were already present, apply. So the reference token issuer should place reference tokens that expire in the same time frame, in the same status list token. But remember, you have about 50 of them available in that case. And then the sentence that was already present remains: as long as all the reference tokens that have reference have not expired, the status list token issuer shall continue to issue the status list token. Once they have all expired, of course, you can stop that. So that's more implementation. It's closer to implementation. It addresses all the cases and puts the focus on one-time use reference token. That's it.
Thanks.
One comment regarding the first part from what you're saying. We kind of have the text already in the current draft, where we are saying that so basically you should be creating status lists with a decent size, right, for herd privacy, and you should not be using like counting up indices. So basically you have a permutation that is chosen already, and then you start basically using the pre-created status list. That is basically part of the current draft, I would say.
I would say it was fully clear for me.
Okay.
I think the difficult part here in some of your suggestions is that the draft that we do is about the status list primarily, and we can only do so much about the reference token. Because we are agnostic to the reference token, we cannot, and we at some point also don't want to make too many guidance about the reference token, because that's not the core of the standard.
Denis just mentioned on how he would sort of implement the size of the token, or how to issue the status values in that status list kind of randomly. So if we have a scenario where, let's say the list is 1,000 entries long, and I get a token request and I need to start a new list because I've already issued, let's say, the last 1,000 tokens. So how you probably don't want to delay the issuance of the tokens, the reference tokens. So how do you then deal with that case? Do you basically issue a token that has 1,000 values, but there's only one value used, or how is that supposed to work? Like in terms of your implementation guidance?
Is it a question for me?
No, to
Okay.
Christian or Paul on the current text. I don't remember that.
So basically, when you currently create a status list, you could pre-fill with some noise to basically hide stuff, but most of the status list will be zeros, and that is valid. So we're basically initializing a status list where most of the entries are valid. And then you would basically start using it or like filling it internally, where you're remembering which index you used for what newly created reference token. And you basically need to create a new status list in advance before your old one is full. If you basically have enough knowledge that you know I need like 4 months, I need 3 status lists with 100,000 entries, and you create them in the beginning, that would be perfect case, but it could also happen when you know, okay, I have a few hundred or thousands places left, I create a new one, and then it's basically prepared when the old one is full.
Okay, so what recommendations do you make on the size of the status list? Did you make one?
I don't think that we do one. No.
Okay.
I think these things get outdated rather soon if you put definite numbers in there. We say that if it is a problem to you, how to do the chunking and what you should care about, how to chunk or partition it into multiple parts, but we don't give exact numbers.
And it's kind of hard to give good numbers because it heavily depends on the revocation rate. Like if you're expecting a use case where most of the entries are valid and most of them are not flipping, then you can have way bigger status lists with small size. So it's kind of hard to make concrete proposals, I would say, without knowing the use case. All right, then next part. Actually, yeah. So like short-lived credentials. The feedback was X509 CRLs weren't that bad a representation of a list of revocations, especially when a small number were revoked. The reasons that environment failed were more complex. I think we should put text in encouraging short-lived tokens instead. We have quite a lot of text about the privacy implications, and we were actually also a bit confused that we didn't explicitly mention short-lived credentials. That is probably something we should do. But this again goes back to the basically requirements and privacy concerns of the use case, so mainly of the reference token. So, but yes, I think we should add a bit of like a short sentence in the rationale that a lot of these things should be rather short-lived. Any opinions on that? Then I will continue with the next issues. I guess we will probably add a short rationale that oftentimes it makes a lot of sense to use status list combined with tokens or credentials that don't live very long. The next feedback we got was status type values. That is the point that was also mentioned beforehand. So the feedback was the allocation of status types in the registry has implications, and I don't think they're the right ones. First, it implies that any application that uses 2 bits has only one application defined status available. Why not always make it application defined and say, here's the default that is useful? On that note, I don't get temporary expiry. Why not reissue in those cases? That was actually a discussion we had before we did the working group the call for adoption for the working group. We were discussing this quite a bit. And our basic idea was that we have a lot of use cases that can be solved by a few default values, and it helps implementations and interoperability quite a bit to have them predefined. The first issue in the repo was actually an issue discussing if we should have like a dynamic definition of what each status means. So like the issuer would be able to define themselves what the bits mean. But our take was that basically you can still do that, but there is value in having these like default values defined, because otherwise interoperability becomes really, really hard. Do people have use cases in mind that need a lot of like custom or like non-standard status types?
So would you envision a case where issuers basically decide for themselves, like define, let's say, 10 values or the other 20 to just have a more fine-grained status list and then make that discoverable, or is that completely outside of scope?
We put that outside of the current scope.
Okay.
Reason was that basically if you have a closed scope, like a closed ecosystem, you can define the values anywhere yourself. But having a machine readable mechanism to basically detect the status and then having whatever your applications discover that and use it is a lot of complexity, where we do not expect a lot of applications to really make use of that. And the comment, so for 2-bit right now, basically we have 0 is defined as valid, 1 is defined as invalid, and then we have defined, I think either 3 or 4, like, sorry, 2 or 3, one of the two, I have to look it up right now, as suspended right now. So there's only 1 bit in the first 4 bits that can be application defined right now. That is what the comment is going at. Yes. So in hex, it's x02 is suspended.
I think it would be good to say somewhere, if you don't do it already, that the value 0, regardless on what the type size, means that it's valid. And everything else is, there's a problem. Because otherwise, I'm worried that you could be tricked into receiving a status list of something that is invalid in, or indicates that the reference token is invalid in one context, and you hand it over in a different context. The signature verifies because you have the same trust anchor, and then you're toast.
That is why we currently have these predefined values, because for interoperability, you need to make sure these things are properly understood.
Yeah, this is not. I'm not so worried about the interoperability, more about the. Or I'm also worried about interoperability, but this one is then even for like bad for a security point of view.
Yeah. Yes, I think, in my opinion, that was the main motivation to fix these values instead of having machine readable, because then maybe some ecosystems would define 0 as revoked and 1 as valid, and some other ecosystem would do it the other way around. And we want to avoid those fuck ups and just fix those very important values that will be sufficient for 98% of all use cases in the standard itself.
So what we envisioned was that basically if you have a use case that doesn't work with these default values at all, you just define your own list basically. But for most use cases we've seen so far, these work. And I think there is implementation, and especially security gains by having these default, like defined. All right, and then the last feedback from the mail was well known. And I don't think so. Like the feedback was, I do like the thoroughness of the security consideration section. Perhaps a well-known URL should be suggested to avoid the tracking vector. And to be fair, we didn't fully understand it. We were hoping this would be brought up in person, but I don't think The person sending the mail is here, right? I don't see Watson.
It was from Watson.
Yeah. So we currently do not really see how a well-known URL would help with like tracking vectors here.
Do you want to discuss that on the mailing list with
Yes.
Watson? Did you? Okay.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. Brian, you have a comment there. Do you want to talk about it? Brian, we can't hear you if you're speaking. So Brian has a question there in the chat. Do you wanna talk about that, Christian?
So I'm currently reading it. My chat didn't work. Yeah, that is a discussion we had a few times. But there were several use cases, especially asking for this suspended status. So that is why we thought, okay, perhaps that makes sense. And we are assuming most use cases to use 1 or 2-bit status lists. Probably most of them will use a 1-bit status list to have 2 statuses, which is valid and invalid. But yeah.
Okay. And Brian, did that answer your question? If you can continue sending that on the chat if you want. Okay, Hannes.
Yeah, I would say, like in response to Brian, at least in the PKIX community, people thought that there would be a need for more than 2. And they have a much longer history. So maybe it would be worthwhile to ask someone like Deb may be able to explain that.
There she is.
Yeah, so
Right.
you mentioned PKIX, and I'm all ears. Sorry. So there you have the issue of whether it's been issued or not, too. So you have valid, revoked, not issued, or suspended. So there was a number of choices. Here you may not have this concept of whether it's issued or not, like they do with certificates and whatnot. As far as I know, that's the only other thing.
So we currently have valid, invalid, and suspended, and it sounds like the not issued one could be mapped to either invalid or suspended as well, right?
Right. Or maybe you don't need it at all because you don't have serial numbers. I mean, it may not be completely analogous, right?
In certain situations, like a mobile driving license, when there is natural persons involved, you also may not want to use suspended because it might reveal some information that you don't want to disclose. So even if it's suspended, you may still use invalid, and then may later on switch it back to valid to not leak this information. But in some use cases, it may be of purpose.
So I will say in the PKIX case, suspended is often an issue because it appears on a CRL for a while with the state of suspended, and then it has to be taken off the CRL, which classically you don't do. So a lot of enterprise systems don't use suspended because it's just too much of a pain in the butt to use, and they just don't use it.
That sounds reasonable, and I guess for a status list, because suspended is the first entry in the second bit, you could just go for the 1-bit option and only have valid, invalid, or you could opt for the 2-bit option and have suspended if you really need it. But like it's a price you have to pay with performance, basically.
Deb, in the PKIX world, there's at least a couple of additional reasons for why the certificate is not valid anymore. Is that something that people really use for some purpose, like whether it was a key compromised or whatever?
So a lot of times they won't mark the reasons because it gives away too much information. So reason codes are not required. They're optional anyway. The result is still whether it's revoked or not revoked. So it's, I don't know.
Okay.
Okay. Peter has a comment question there.
Yeah, it's simple enough. I wonder if the whole question around how to interpret the status is really application or deployment specific. And in which case sort of the valid invalid may give you enough granularity. And if you have an environment where you need more granularity, it sounds like it's extensible, so you can define additional things. But maybe it's not you don't have to sort of try and exhaustively define all of these, because they may just not be desirable in many cases.
Do you mean that we should not set suspended as a predefined value, but use anything but 0 and 1 as application specific?
That might be one path to go, right? Unless you have very clear reasons. But suspended, like we've talked here already, it's problematic. And it's also just from a practical perspective, right? That concept that now it's on the list, now it has to be taken off the list. What happens if you don't get it off the list? What happens if that list doesn't propagate properly throughout the system? I don't know. Maybe you should only define the things that you absolutely need, and then leave the rest up to, if you've got an MDL deployment, you may want to use this one way. If you've got an enterprise deployment, maybe there's other kinds of status codes that's relevant. But maybe just sort of try and minimize the number of status codes that to the absolute minimum list that you need. Because the point around privacy leaking, and not just privacy, but it leaks other kinds of information, right? Has the credential been issued? Well, the fact that it hasn't been issued, that could leak information too, right? Or the fact that it has been issued, but is in some other state, right? So I think you may just want to limit that.
We currently only define the 3 values because of that. But there were quite a few people asking for suspended, but if there's enough opinion to remove it, we are happy to remove it. So currently, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's worth sort of taking the lessons, like as Deb pointed out, right? Even just the practical considerations around suspended. Maybe just leave an extension point for folks who really want that. Or alternatively, if you do have it in there, this is maybe the other better option. If you do have lots of stakeholders who want suspended, document, right? All the ways in which suspended is problematic. Information leakage, the practicalities of removing in distributed systems and so on. So I'd say that's the 2 options. Either just pare it down to the 2 states, or if you want the additional states, make clear that everybody understands the implications of having that state and using it.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Denny.
Yeah, thank you. I'm an advocate of using suspension. Suspension is very important because let us suppose that I lost my smartphone. Well, if I revoke the credentials that are in my smartphone, it may take time to have another smartphone. And if I find my smartphone again 5 minutes after, well, I would have said, well, I should have suspended it because it's easier to recover the use of the smartphone in that case. Now, there was a problem when using CRLs because people expanded for the use case of delta CRLs. And delta CRLs with suspension is a nightmare. So that is one of the reasons was it was not really useful. But the most important is to support suspension. And I believe that supporting 2 bits should be enough. And if you want to interoperate, well, I would recommend that people should support 2 bits. More than 2 bits, I really don't see what would be the advantage. And maybe we should just consider 2 cases, 1 bit or 2 bits, unless people say really what they want to do when there are more than 2 bits available. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Denis. Hannes?
Yeah, I liked what Peter was saying. It's sort of like it probably depends to what Denis has been adding on the lost phone example. It depends a little bit on how complicated it is to get new credentials, sort of refresh them, get new ones, or how difficult it is to get from the suspension mode into sort of like the original mode. But I think it's probably very deployment specific, so it's a little hard to tell, I guess. Did the people who were in favor of the suspension mode explain what is status value? Did they explain their use case?
I don't remember, but yeah, I think what was pointed out is a good example, because you can either for privacy reasons do suspension by just setting it to revoked or not, and then later on you can switch it back. But if the status revoke then causes an action at the relying party and he may delete something or do something, then in these cases, it may be important to differentiate between revoked and suspended, because then suspended gives them the information that, okay, I should not do something now, but I should not maybe do a irreversible action, but just requery in a certain time frame. So, yeah, but I don't know if we have very well explained scenarios about suspended or not. There was one about mobile driving license where you could say, okay, if I have my mobile driving license suspended, that would communicate that I'm able to drive, that I'm able to prove my age and my identity, but I'm not able to drive. I think that's the only well-known one that I know of.
Okay. You have less than 2 minutes. Denis, last quick comment from you. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, basically, revocation is made at the request of the issuer, but at the request of the user may request either suspension or revocation. And in practice, what he will do is immediately after he has, let us say, lost the smartphone, he can ask for suspension because he knows that the next step will be either he find again the smartphone and it will just be unable to use the smartphone during a few hours, or he really thinks that he will never find again the smartphone, and then in another step, it asks for revocation. And revocation is the end of the story. He knows that he will never use the credentials that were on the smartphone again. So it's very useful because the user can, well, decide to ask suspension. If he can only decide to ask revocation, he will not dare to do it immediately because he say, well, if I find again my smartphone, I should have done revocation. If suspension is available, he can do it. So it's much more secure. Thank you.
Thanks, Denis. Okay. Christian and Paul, maybe wrap up here. And I think you still have some work on this document, or maybe this specific kind of issue let's continue discussing on the mailing list. What do you think? What's your thought?
So regarding suspended, it sounds we have
Yes.
two possible
Yeah.
scenarios, right?
Right.
One would be
Yes.
removing it, and the other one would
Mhm.
be having a broader section explaining the privacy implication that might be there because
Right.
of suspended state.
Right. Let's have that discussion on the mailing list and see what's the work group want to do with this. That's it. Like so. Otherwise, like you still have few things to update this document, and then we'll see what goes after that. We'll make a final decision. I think you still have the work group last call is still ongoing right now, so it ends later this week, I believe, if I remember correctly. Okay. Anything else from Christian and Paul?
We covered all points we had prepared, so I think
Okay.
that would be us from our side.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone. And let's end it
Thank
here.
you, guys.
Thanks, and have a nice day.
Bye. Yeah, you too.
Thank you.